Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Today I am particularly excited to be joined by the great Dan Barker. And I can't imagine that any of you won't know who Dan Barker is, but Dan Barker, I'm sure he will introduce himself thusly, is an author of some great renown in our circles of atheology and religion and so on and so forth. And I'll show you some of the books in a little while. A former pastor who famously sort of deconverted, and he's been very kind in agreeing to come and have a chat with me, but also particularly kind in agreeing to write the foreword, which I loved, and I know other people loved. It's quite a tongue-in-cheek foreword that he's written to my latest book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God. There it is.
Yeah.
Heaven, hell, divine.
And it's actually autographed in here. So look at that.
Yeah, nice one. That I should get your free will book because I've got one autograph by you. But yeah, so really appreciated him doing this. Wrote the foreword and also endorsed my resurrection book as well. So that's fantastic. Really appreciate that. And he's agreed to come on. So Dan, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. But first of all, what did you say? Atypical? What is that?
Atypical philosopher. So Atypical philosopher. So the name it was the name of my blog and now is sort of my column at OnlySky. But what happens is a group of friends and myself, in fact, we had one only 2 nights ago, but it used to be once a month, once in a while these days. We go down a pub, pick a subject and talk about it and have a somewhat sort of formal philosophical debate about it and then drink beers. So it's atypical philosophy. We are called the Tippling Philosophers.
So does the beer help or does it hurt?
Some might say, that's the famous saying, in vino veritas. So the truth comes out in wine. So maybe people are a bit more truthful, but maybe making a little less sense. I don't know. But so Dan, you have a very interesting story in how you've been. You were sort of maybe inculcated into a religion and to a church, and then famously, as a pastor, came out of religion. Do you want to just sort of introduce a little bit about your background first?
Well, it seems like ancient history now. I started preaching as a teenager. My first sermon that I ever preached was in 1966 in Mexico with very bad Spanish. My Spanish got better. And then I was ordained to the ministry. I went to a Christian college, got a degree in religion. I was a co-pastor of 3 different California churches, Bible believing, evangelical, conservative type, born again churches. For a while I was an associate pastor in an Assembly of God church, and that's Pentecostal. The speaking in tongues, and I thought they were really sweet, sincere people, but boy, they were way too noisy for my taste, if you know what I mean. All of this, and it's an interesting thing. I think people should be exposed to that part of, I guess it happens in Britain too, but that part of America where you have these tongue speakers, faith healer types. And I was the pianist for the famous faith healer, Catherine Kuhlman, for her choir there when she came to the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles for a while. I was a Christian songwriter. I was a missionary to Mexico for about 2 years total. I was a cross-country evangelist for about 8 years. I wrote a number of Christian musicals and songs. In fact, I'm still getting royalties today from that music.
Wow.
And that all ended in the early to mid 80s after about 4 or 5 years of thinking, reevaluating. I didn't want to discard Christianity. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was the truth. But, within Christianity, there is no one Christianity. There's a huge continuum from conservatives to more moderates to more liberal types. And what happened to me is my theology, I didn't just jump from a born-again Christian to atheist. My theology went within Christianity through a transformation to where I started preaching less about hell and more about love. I started becoming more of a moderate believer, more of a moderate preacher. I started preaching less about the afterlife and more about how do you live this life. But then eventually, as I read more and studied more science, and some history, I became more of one of those liberal Christians, which are filling a lot of pulpits around the world, where I believed in God, but I thought the Bible was not so reliable as I used to think it was. So I went through this whole thing. Basically, it was the Bible and morality and basically truth. Is it true or not? And eventually, after about 5 years, in the summer of 1983, after 19 years of preaching, the phrase I like to use is that I threw out all the bathwater and I found out, hey, there's no baby there. It's, if you keep peeling back the onion, like what is essential and what isn't, like what C.S. Lewis tried to do with his book, Mere Christianity. You peel back all the stuff that's not essential, and where's the core? And pretty soon you keep peeling, and then what's there? I discovered there's no, not even a good definition of a God that's even coherent. What is this thing? There's no good evidence for a God. There's no good argument for a God. There's no good reply to the problem of evil. There's no agreement among believers across the spectrum about the nature of this God or his moral principles. And there's, the Bible and holy books are not as reliable as I thought they were. And ultimately, there's no need for a God. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions of good people on this planet live happy, meaningful, moral, productive, loving lives without the belief in the supernatural. So I popped all the way out, and I didn't like the word atheist, but I thought, I guess that's the word that describes me, at least with the lowercase a. And
I guess for some people it's a case of peeling back that onion until you think you come to a core. But for some people, that's an arbitrary stopping point, and you would be someone that's actually, no, we've still got further that we can peel this thing back. And until there's nothing.
So there's no onion, I mean, all it's humans, it's human ideas, human thoughts, and you can understand that the desire for meaning, the desire for community, the human longing for beauty, for hope, all of those things are very human things. If you look at Islamic architecture, we might be visiting the Alhambra in August in Spain. If you look at Islamic,
I've been there, it's beautiful.
Wow, look at that. You don't have to be a Muslim to admire that art, that human yearning, that human expression of something or whatever that is. You can say that's beautiful. And I think in many religions, although there's a lot of ugliness in many religions, there's also a lot of beauty, and the beauty is a human beauty that's this yearning. So I think most believers, most Christians are good people. I think they have good motives, most of them, except for the extreme right wing, the Christian nationalist types who don't have good motives. They want to oppress people. But I think in general, most believers are good people, and they're using their religion as a vehicle for that, where many of the rest of us don't need that vehicle. We don't need the onion, if you will. We can live.
Which is to say, I think what you're saying there is that most people are good people.
Yeah.
And of which some of those people are Christians, and some of those people are atheists, and some of those people are Muslims, and most people are good people. But there are your extreme, positions in any kind of worldview where those people aren't good people.
Yeah.
But it's whether they are co-opting these ideas because they're already bad, or whether those ideas are making them bad. There's the argument always about the direction of causality there. Is it the religious fundamentalism that is driving them to be bad people, or is it the fact that they're bad people wanting a kind of oppressive understanding of their worldview that means that they adopt religious fundamentalism?
Yeah, there's that question of causality. Like there is a correlation between smoking and depression, for example. Smokers tend to be more depressed, but depressed people tend to smoke more. So which way is it? Is it, you know what I mean? So I think the same thing is true. The people tend to come to the church that it's kind of a self-selection thing.
Yeah.
The emotional types tend to want to go to the holy roller churches, but the more intellectual type, liberal types tend to want to go to the more, let's say, a liberal Anglican church or something. So it's kind of hard to tease out the causality, but I think you're right. There are some really crappy atheists in the world too.
Yeah.
But at least atheism doesn't have this holy book that says you should kill unbelievers. It doesn't have those threats in it, at least like a lot of religious systems have.
Yes, absolutely. Just before we go on, the great John and the great Dan Barker together, this will be good. Thanks to you both. Thank you, Off Grid. Really, really generous. And thank you for putting me even remotely alongside Dan. But I do appreciate that and appreciate all your support. And Dustin Ellaby says, 2 of my favorite humans on the planet. I've learned so much from both of you. Thank you both for your works. Really, really generous.
He called you Jono?
Yes, yeah, so I'm Jono, Johnny, Jonathan. I'm basically whatever you want to call me is fine.
But not John the Evangelist. But
no, well, maybe I do evangelize my own kind of. There's an interesting thing you said about the evangelical churches, and you must have them in the UK. Actually, we don't really, there's not a great culture over here of having those Pentecostal, really in your face, kind of overt, brash kind of churches and religiosity. And that makes, sometimes I wonder why that is. Why does America have this very bombastic types of church, and the UK, we have, maybe is it the tradition of the Church of England, which is very kind of mute and Sunday morning dirges singing in a very grey chapel. I don't know. Have you ever wondered why America has a particular strains of Christianity that are like they are?
Well, I know the answer. It's historical. Australia and America were both settled by rejects from England. Australia by the criminals, and America by the Puritans. And I think Australia got the better deal. So I think you found a way to get rid of and send it overseas, and here we are, stuck with it.
Yeah, so yeah, maybe out of that puritanical like culture, you get that form of I don't know, Protestantism that has birthed this evangelical movement and fundamentalist Christianity that America seems to be famous for. But yeah, I think there's just a really interesting difference. So when you were leaving the church, what were the first bit? I mean, you sort of talked to it a little bit, but what were the first big ideas that you had problems with? Were they theological, or were they like environmental?
Well, in the very beginning, and at that point, I didn't know and wouldn't say that I was leaving. You know what I mean? I would say that I was improving my theology within Christianity. You know what I mean? But looking back on it, I can see the seeds of that general movement that eventually went through that spectrum and popped out the other side. So way back in the early part, I didn't have doubts, but I had questions. And one of the early ones, this was probably around 1978 or 9, I was invited to preach at a church in Ontario, California, some kind of Baptist church. And, you know, before the meeting, sometimes the pastoral staff, we'd get together in the pastor's office or somewhere, and we would pray, like kind of like a football huddle. Dear God, bless this meeting, and may the Holy Spirit touch hearts, and may you bless Barker's ministry. I was an invited guest minister. And plus, I was a known Christian songwriter, so they wanted to hear some of my music. And in that pastor's office, before I went up to the stage, he was just sort of casually commenting to me that he said, we have a couple of members of our congregation who don't think Adam and Eve were historical. And I thought, what? And you allow them to be members? He said, don't get me wrong. I think Adam and Eve were actual people. There was a real Adam. He said, I believe, but these people in my church think that just like Jesus spoke in parables, there really was no prodigal son, or there really was no actual good Samaritan. These were parables that were invented. The prodigal son doesn't even have a name. It's just the parable of the prodigal son. And if Jesus was free to invent or to copy an invented story that actually at its surface level isn't true, but which contains a deep moral teaching and a moral truth, then the early Israelites would have and could have done the same thing with some of their ancient early teachings. So there didn't have to be an actual Adam and Eve. And the Israelites didn't even intend for their listeners to think there was actually a real Adam and Eve. Like, did Jesus intend his listeners to think there was a real Good Samaritan, or was it a story? It was made up to teach a lesson. And I thought that was heresy. I thought, wow, how can you treat the word of God, the truth of God, like it's some kind of a made up? But of course, then if Jesus could do it. And so that was an early question that didn't lead to atheism, but it led me to think what it did. It was, I did not discard what I believed was the historicity of Adam and Eve. I didn't do that. But what I did was I thought, well, okay, these are good Christian people. They pray, they go to church, they're moral. They have a different interpretation than I do, but that should not stop me from fellowshipping with them because we have a difference of opinion. That might seem like a pretty simple thing to do, but in my fundamentalist mind at the time, which everything is black and white, there can't be any gray areas. That was really a move for me to go, not toward liberalism, but a slight move away from extreme conservatism where I didn't have to be so hard-nosed, so absolutistic in my thinking. So it was things like that started my movement.
I think that's a really interesting observation. That's sometimes what moves you is just that the acceptance that there are other views, and then possibly ruminating on that, and that if these are good people and they believe that, and I think their theology may be a bit wrong, but they're still decent people, is God going to punish them for being slightly wrong in their theology? And therefore, if I think they're not going to be punished because they're decent people, then it's the goodness of them as people rather than exactly what they believe that's important.
Yeah, that is true, but also what's happening in me. Am I so arrogant to think that after millennia of disagreements of theology, I'm the one who's going to be above them? It was a bit of a humbling. It was a bit of a, wait a minute. You know what I mean? Am I an absolutistic, black and white thinker? Like Jesus said, you should be hot or cold, or I'll spit you out of my mouth. Is that the way the world works? Or can I maybe just drop down a notch and say, wait a minute, I'm part of a bigger family here that's broader than my own particular narrow views. So that was sort of the beginning of my general migration. I remember that thought.
Yeah. So that as you generally liberalized your theology and your beliefs, you eventually got to a point. What was like the tipping point as far as leaving the church or finally accepting that you didn't believe?
So, of course, that initial move, which wasn't a move to atheism, obviously, but that initial move brought into question the interpretation of what I thought was the perfect word of God. So it was the Bible. Is the Bible telling the truth or not? So as I studied and read more, that was a big issue for me. It's not a big issue for all Christians. I think there's a lot of Anglicans who accept the fact that the Bible has contradictions and it doesn't bother them. There's a lot of Episcopalians and others who say, yeah, what are you worried about? But for a fundamentalist like me, it was a big worry because it meant giving up black and white. It meant giving up absolutistic, or what I like to call binary brains. It's either something can't be half moral, something can't be half sinful. It's either true or false, that kind of thing. But as I moved along, eventually, and this is making a long story very short, eventually I came to the point in 1983 where I realized, well, okay, if the prodigal son is a parable, and if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, what else in the Bible is just a figure of speech? Maybe Yahweh, maybe God himself is just one huge figure of speech, a parable that the human race has put together to try to give itself some structure and meaning, and maybe it does teach some important moral truths. But is it necessary for God himself to actually exist? Like, was it necessary for the prodigal son himself to actually exist for that message to have some importance? And I got to this point where I realized, well, this God thing doesn't really even have to exist. And that was sort of the whole process of this, whatever you want to call it, liberalizing or deconverting in my brain.
And so what was the actual sort of, how did you leave the church? I mean, because what especially as a pastor, right, or someone who's involved in the church machinations as you were, like songwriting and the musical side of it, it's not just like saying, oh, I've changed my beliefs, a little bit. So yeah, there you go. It's not like maybe moving a job to some degree. It's like your whole life is your church.
Yeah, exactly.
And so how did you find that? How were you able to cope with that?
So first, let me point out that general question we have addressed with this group called the Clergy Project,
of course,
which was really three different things that came together. Richard Dawkins and I and the philosopher Daniel Dennett, sort of the three threads came together at this point to realize, and Richard even said, there's people in the church that I know of who don't believe it all, but what are they going to do? In today's job economy, what good is a divinity degree? I mean, how are you going to change? So the Clergy Project came into existence in 2011 with 52 former and active clergy, either priests, preachers, monks, rabbis, nuns, a couple of imams. And now there are almost 1,200 who are in the group. People who used to believe, who used to be professional clergy like me, who have abandoned the supernatural. What do? In my case, I think I was kind of lucky. A lot of them are not so lucky. Some of them have had some horrible stories. But in my case, since I was moving from church pastoring into evangelism, I was no longer rooted at a particular church. There was a home church in California that was sort of my home base, but I knew pastors and churches all over the country and in Mexico and a couple up in Canada. And so I wasn't so rooted that I had to get up in the pulpit one Sunday morning and say, hey, I'm resigning. It wasn't that. I was living by faith as an evangelist, Christian songwriter. And I was also, as a Christian songwriter, I was also a record producer of mostly Christian music. Manuel Bonilla, for example, I think he still is the leading Spanish-speaking Christian recording artist in the world. He has dozens of albums. He came to California, and I was his producer for a long time. So I learned how to produce and how to work in studios, and so I was doing a lot of that. So at the time that I was ready to leave, I was still preaching. I still had invitations every Sunday to go out and preach, all the way through the rest of the year as an evangelist and as a Christian songwriter. So I was able to kind of just back off without making any formal announcement at any time. And in the summer of '83, when I knew I was an atheist, even though I didn't like the word at the time, I do now, but at the time I thought, ooh, atheist, ooh, because I misunderstood it. I still had, after the summer of '83, where I had this, what you might call, not a religious experience, but the opposite. What would you call the opposite of a religious experience? An awakening or something.
Yeah.
Where I realized, I was down in Mexico in this little church, where I realized that I was completely alone in that room and looking at the stars and all of that. I write about that in my book. It's quite moving for me, actually.
Yeah.
To realize that who I am. I'm a human animal. I'm a natural creature in a natural environment. And like those stars are going to burn out someday, I'm glowing faintly and I'm going to burn out someday. I still had on my calendar a bunch of invitations to preach. And, it's kind of like if your marriage is over and you both know it, where is that exact moment when you actually walk out the door? When is that? Because there's a lot of factors that you have to think of, especially if you have kids. You can't, so I was thinking the same thing. How do I stop on a dime? So for about 4 months, I was a hypocrite. For about 4 months, I continued to accept these invitations. They didn't pay well, but it was part of my livelihood. I was as a preacher and a Christian songwriter and record producer. And I hated myself. I would get up and I would say all the things that I've been saying for decades, and the audience would amen and praise God and all of that. And in fact, I remember one service where I preached at this church I think in the fall of '83, somewhere in there. And afterwards, a woman came up to me from the audience with tears in her eyes. And she said, Reverend Barker, I want you to know I felt the Spirit of God on your ministry tonight. And I was thinking, I didn't say anything to her, but I was thinking, you did? I mean, because
wow,
I was basically faking it. I knew I was, and I knew I shouldn't, and I knew it was wrong, and it was dishonest to me and to them. And yet the audience out there was getting something from that. Why? It was a good illustration of how this whole thing is a big drama. It's a
Yeah.
big, there would be no preachers if there weren't an audience, if there were not a congregation going along with it. If they stood up in an empty room. So it took me, and I tell the story in my book, Godless, it took me until December of that year when I finally had this moment where I almost just stopped in the middle and told everybody this is crap. I couldn't do it anymore. So in January, I wrote a letter to all my friends and relatives and families and Christian publishers and co-missionaries and co-pastors. I wrote a one-page letter, very brief, explaining to them that I no longer believe, don't invite me to preach anymore. And I reproduced that letter in the book too. You can read it, inviting further discussion. And the reactions I got, well, if you can imagine the reaction, I got it. I got everything from warm, loving reactions from Christian friends who were still friends today. We like each other as people. They're just decent people. And we realized that our friendship was really based on a mutual, attraction. But I also got the other extreme, hateful, ugly, surprising, angry responses from people that I thought were friends. And I realized painfully, I guess they really weren't friends, because a true friendship could weather something like that. So,
Well, I suppose that just shows you that God is more important than a friend, in that kind of hierarchy.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, that happened with my Christian marriage. She bent as far as she could, to her credit. It wasn't just theology; it was also feminism, because I was waking up to the idea that patriarchy is a real scourge on the planet. That men and women should be equal in opportunity, whereas she and I had come from a structure where the man was the head of the woman, the woman was the helpmeet to the man, and that I was the head of the house, and that she wanted to be a minister's wife. And so she tried, but she could not really wrap around feminism. She thought it was too liberal. And I really wanted this. I wanted us to be, any of us could walk away at any time. We are together because we love each other mutually, and it's not because we're under some structure that's forcing us, She had to have that. And after we divorced a few years later, she remarried a Baptist minister, which shows you that that was her. And I'm glad, and I'm happy for her. I'm glad she did. And they seem happy. And so it was a proof that what we had would not have worked any longer than it did.
No.
So, and then I got a job for a while as a computer programmer back in 84, 85. I programmed in assembly language. I programmed in C. I programmed in Pascal for industry. The first was for petroleum tank monitoring systems. And then the second was for railroads. That was a blast. We were building from the bottom up a monitoring, dispatching system for the railroads in 5 different states with real trains on real tracks. It was really a fun thing. And then after that, I started working with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and they hired me in 1987. So that was a perfect job for me.
Yeah, and we'll move on to that. That's an interesting. I didn't realize you've been involved with them for that long, actually. So that's something that's quite remarkable. Mitch asks, I'd be interested to hear, and thank you very much for your support, Mitch. Really, really appreciated, Mitch Mazarol. To hear what trends in atheism generally are negative or unhelpful from Dan's perspective. Some internal critique, so to speak. Well, before we get there, when you moved from, and I appreciate that, Mitch, and I will that'll come next. So when you moved down from religion to non-religion, what feeling did you have? A lot of people I speak to feel a sense of liberation. So a lot of burdens off their shoulder. I can actually believe and do what I want to believe and do.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you get that sense of what was great about your newfound belief system? And then I suppose Mitch's question is, then where are we struggling now? But what was?
Well, so I think the main thing I think for me is the freedom to think for yourself. that there's no big eyeball up there judging your thoughts, that there's no big orthodoxy to which you have to conform your thinking. That I can decide for myself what principles I'm going to use. Because I think a lot of believers, not all of them, some of them are smart and informed, but a lot of believers are just going along because someone else has done their thinking for them, right? They don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. We have our seminaries, we have our theologians, we have our church doctrines. That's already been thought through. And so this is what I'm accepting as the truth, right?
And there's an argument to say, I mean, I've had that conversation before with people where it's like, you can let some people, that's a good thing. It's like we talk about, oh, now, Dan, you can think for yourself and do all this thinking, be the person you want to be. But some people actually like to be told what to think and what to do.
Well, because it takes energy, it takes time, it takes reading, it takes studying, it takes holding back and withholding judgment for a while and putting pieces together. And that's an exciting thing to do, but it's not easy. It's not easy to do that. And to actually commit yourself proactively to digging and thinking for yourself, as if you have the ability to make that judgment on your own. I mean, after all, Christians are asked to judge, to accept God, right? They're asked to make a judgment of their mind, yes or no, about Jesus. So to make another judgment about the very existence of God and all of these other questions, because there's about a dozen general fields of inquiry, if you want to get into it, a lot of people, as you say, just don't. They would rather say, well, when you're looking online for books or something, and you see bestsellers, you think, oh, well, bestsellers must mean that these are good because all these other people, right? Oh, I'm going to see what the best, I want other people to do my thinking for me. But there's something in that. I mean, I look for bestsellers because I don't want to buy junky books, right? But on the other hand, wouldn't there be a better way of thinking through if I could make my decisions in a more informed way? So yeah, it is that it's exhilarating. I remember that moment in that little church in Mexico when I realized for the first time that there was just me in the universe and other sentient organisms in the same species and other species. It was almost like it was like exciting but scary at the same time. Maybe like skydiving or mountain climbing or something that you're going to do that involves some risk but freedom. You have freedom, but there's. So I had that kind of a feeling of, wow, this is great. I'm on my own here. I'm doing this, and
it's
so
quite daunting, isn't it? Like, where is this going to lead? And that uncertainty. I mean, but as Stacey says, it takes being okay with uncertainty, and I think that's one of the things that religion gives you. It gives you certainty because it proclaims that God answers all these questions, and that religion and the holy books answer all the questions you might have, and therefore you don't need to deal with being uncertain. But if you ditch all of that, then suddenly, oh my goodness, I'm really not sure how to construct my morality. I'm really not sure what to think about X, Y, and Z, and I don't know how the universe began. What do you have anything to say about uncertainty?
Well, I think you're right that there are some people who prefer the certainty. They just have to have that. And a big part of that, I think, is, what if I'm wrong? I mean, if you believe in hell, for example, as I used to, I mean, am I risking my eternal life and happiness because of some stupid mistake I'm making today? And who am I? Am I smarter than all the theologians? Am I smarter than Aquinas? Am I smarter than Augustine? Am I smarter than the Pope or Billy Graham? I mean, these are great people. And, so for me to go out on my own and think my own thoughts, that's like, it's almost like spitting on their faces. Like, you people are stupid and dumb. I'm going to think for myself. So there's a lot of people who don't want to take that move. And I would say, fine, as long as their beliefs are not causing harm in the world, as long as they're not, you know what I mean? If you want to stand on your head and pray to Mother Goose, right? Fine. As long as that belief in Mother Goose isn't causing you to deny human rights or to cause some kind of harm in the world, And people should be judged by their actions.
Yeah, I think I've come to really agree with that more of late, which is like, I used to be very much like, well, you believe nonsense, therefore I need to disabuse you of that belief. Nowadays, I'm kind of more like, I don't mind what you believe if it is morally neutral. So if your belief system doesn't in some way have a negative moral outcome for other people, then I don't mind what you believe. As you say,
Yeah.
you know, stand on your head and pray to Mother Goose, whatever. But as soon as you start making moral diktats for other people that are negative, then we've got a problem.
Yeah. And we've noticed, especially here in Madison, Wisconsin, where we live, where the Freedom from Religion Foundation is headquartered, that in this town, most of the believers in God are quite liberal and progressive. And so we find ourselves marching in the same marches.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and you know what I mean? And they know that we're atheists, and we know that they're churchgoers, but the moral issues are what we care about, you know?
Yeah.
And so, and in fact, just earlier this year, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is overtly free thought, atheist and agnostic, we partnered with the Southern Baptist Committee for Religious Liberty to produce a joint report about Christian nationalism at the January 6th insurrection. And we interviewed the leader, the Baptist, the woman, you know, she's in fact, on our TV show, we've interviewed a number of believing church-going Christians and sometimes some Jews who disagree with us philosophically on the question of God, but we all put that aside because we realize that what's important is how do we live our lives in the real world.
Yeah. So to return to what Mitch then said, which is, okay, so now you're the atheistic movement, if you will, if you can call it a movement, maybe that's an answer to one of these questions. What's one of the biggest challenges? What's a negative aspect of atheism? Maybe it's like herding cats. What do you see as a challenge within sort of atheistic or humanistic movements at the moment, if there are any?
So you raise a good question there. Is it a movement? And I guess in the loose demographic sense, it's a movement. But I think a movement needs followers. And I don't think in atheism or free thought, there are followers. Each one of us is our own leader.
Interesting.
You know what I mean? It's not top down. There's a movement and we're all like following behind it. But it's a more bottom up thing.
It's a collective movement. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you could call it a movement in a sense. But it, you know, if you were to stand up and declare yourself the atheist bishop of Southern England, right? There would be a whole bunch of atheists who would say, forget you. I'm going to think my own thought. I don't need some structure up there, top down structure. So there are atheist agnostics and state church groups, organizations like ours is one of them, who do have members. We have about 37,000 members now, but you know, we're not threatening them with hell if they leave us. We're not, it's all totally voluntary. They join because they like what we're doing. And so some people complain, and I don't think this is a legitimate complaint, but some people complain that there's too many groups. We all need to get together and be one group. I think there's value in the alphabet soup of multiplicity of different groups with different agendas, because if we were all just one group, what do you do with that talent? You know what I mean? What do you do with all that leadership talent if there's just one group? There is in the United States an umbrella group called the Secular Coalition,
Right.
which is a group of groups, and it's a lobbying organization. And right now there's 20 different national and regional organizations that have joined together in this coalition. Not that we agree on everything, and we often don't. Sometimes there are things that we disagree about on strategy, on legal approaches and such. But we do come together as a single voice when it comes to lobbying the government and Congress on particular issues that are of interest to the secular community. So we do get along in that sense.
And that speaks of one of the huge challenges that, particularly in America, the secular community faces, which is the power that it doesn't have. So when you look at the religious right in America, politically speaking, they have huge lobbying groups and interests that can then wield disproportionate power in terms of their demographic sort of representation. Whereas, you know, the amount of money that secular and atheistic groups are spending to lobbying and get things changed is a drop in the ocean. I mean, do you see that as a fundamental problem?
It is. Although a number of our groups, and I think we could say something similar about Humanist UK. You know, there are groups in the UK, and there's groups all over the world that are doing these things. We do we do have generous donors to the group, which help us to do. In fact, besides being a member of the Secular Coalition for America as an organization, our organization has we have our own lobbyist as well, who lives in DC, who does now after COVID's dying down, more face to face, but actually meeting with members of Congress, meeting with staff, and so on. And so we are noticing a difference. Not only is the society changing, not only are the demographics showing that America is much less religious now than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago, especially among young people, but so is the makeup in Congress. Now, for the first time, you've probably heard, in the House of Representatives, there is a caucus, the Free Thought Caucus of, I think they might have 20. There's between 15 and 20 members of Congress who are part of the Free Thought.
I didn't know it was that much. I know that still I don't think anyone openly calls themselves an atheist, which I think is quite an interesting thing. Like, as a label, it's still got this negative stigma attached to it. So people will say I'm humanist, or like I'm a free thinker, but no one openly says, yeah, I'm an atheist, at least not in the Senate or the House of Representatives. But
that's true, and that's more of a branding or labeling thing. But
yeah, of course.
On our TV show, Free Thought Matters, we have interviewed a number of members of Congress, including Jared Huffman, who represents California's 2nd Congressional District, who is the first openly non-religious. He says on our show, he says, I don't believe in God. He didn't actually say, I am an atheist, but he says, I don't believe in God. And he said, by the way, there are many other members of Congress that I know personally who do not believe in God, but for political reasons, you know what I mean? And some of them joined the Unitarian Church, because the Unitarian Church provides great cover. You know, you can say, hey, I'm a church member, you know, although they may not be religious. And there are some Jewish members of Congress, and many American Jews, you know, they love their culture. They're devoted to their Judaistic culture, but they don't believe in the theology. And in fact, some of them are members of the Free Thought Caucus. So things are changing. And so our lobbyist and the SCA, the Secular Coalition's lobbying efforts, are working with the Free Thought Caucus of the House of Representatives, who in general appreciate the feedback, because lobbyists are not always bad. You think of lobbyists as going in and pushing for a particular interest, but many members of Congress don't know everything, and they want feedback from certain communities. They want to know what the Muslim community is saying. They want to hear from, you know, what the Indian American Hindu community. They want to know what the secular community is saying. So we are able.
Some of these lobbyists are actually lobbying because they believe in that thing. Do you know what? It's not like I'm lobbying for the gun you know, lobby because basically they're paying me lots of money to do this, and I'm kind of ambivalent about whether guns are good or bad. But you know, if you're going to be lobbying for the Secular Coalition, then surely there's going to be some element about the work you're doing that is, I am a secularist, and I you know, so on and so forth.
And I want to point out that maybe the fears are overblown, political fears, because Jared Huffman came out as a non-believer in Congress. He wasn't the first in history. I mean, there were others, Pete Stark before that, but at the current time, he was the first and only who came out as an open non-believer.
Before
and it was before his election. So everyone was wondering, well, how's that going to affect now that everybody knows in his district, right? And at the next election after that, he actually did better.
Yeah.
And he said it's because, and I'm sure this is true in England, it's because the people, they care about the issues. They care about what I'm there for. They don't care about my beliefs or non-beliefs. They want to know what I'm actually doing to make our district and our country a better place.
Yeah. So what is it that and before we go on, and this is in to what you were saying earlier about sort of what we were both talking about, certainty and uncertainty. Thank you so much to Del McKenzie, 666. Always a great contribution. My entire family wants their priest or pastor to do their thinking. They can't abide uncertainty. Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. And some people, that's good for them, and so therefore a church community is a good fit for them because it does the thinking for them.
Yeah. So the temptation is to call this is unkind. The temptation is to call those people lazy. Why don't they do their own thinking? But on the other hand, we all do that, don't we? I don't have a PhD in science. I have to accept the findings of the scientific consensus on many issues. If I had some questions about it, of course, I might want to study in greater depth. But I think we all, as human beings, have that tendency to want to, in many cases, take the path of least resistance.
Yeah. And but hopefully in terms of science, you'll go into the consensus thinking on science, because actually that's, you've got good inductive reasoning to do so. And if most scientists believe this thing, then you're probably in good company to believe that. But
yeah.
If you're deferring to a priest to tell you things about morality, I don't know if that's somewhat different. So the FFRF, explain what that is and what the work you do is.
So the Freedom from Religion Foundation started in the mid-1970s, primarily as a result of feminism and the women's movement. Ann Nickel Gaylor and her daughter, Annie Laurie Gaylor, Annie Laurie was in college at the time, were lobbying for women's rights and birth control and abortion rights and women's opportunities and so on. And they noticed that the main opposition was from the church. The main organized opposition to it was religious. And they went to some governmental meeting, and before the meeting started, they were there to testify on some issue. A priest got up and prayed at a secular meeting. And so they objected to that. And then the newspapers said, "Why are you objecting?" And Ann Gaylor said, "Well, we need freedom from religion, not just in our personal lives, but we need our government to be free from religion." So the Freedom from Religion Foundation started with two basic purposes. The first is to keep state and church separate. That's freedom from religion at the governmental level, and meaning that people are free to believe what they want, but the government has to be neutral. The government above us can't take sides, can't interfere, can't tell you what to believe or not to believe. Our second purpose is to educate the public about the views of non-theists, whatever we call ourselves, atheists. Most of our members call themselves atheists, but some call themselves agnostics or secular humanists, or we don't care. And some of them invent weird names for themselves. One guy calls himself an igtheist. I just don't know. Another calls himself.
Yeah, that's the idea that you literally can't know what God is. It's like you can't define God. God is indefinable. Yeah. But
and if it's indefinable, how can its opposite be even meaningful? Yeah. And one guy calls himself an athean because he doesn't want to be a part of any ism. So you know what I mean? So we don't care. What we like to say is we don't care what label you pick. We all disbelieve in the same God.
Yeah. And but what's frustrating is that from an American point of view, and I'm speaking for Americans here, sitting comfortably in the UK, what is frustrating is it seems that the work of the FFRF is as important now as it ever has been. And it's like there's this, you talk about democratic backsliding, but there's like democratic backsliding, but there's also constitutional backsliding, arguably. Like, do you think are things worse now than they were 20 years ago, or are we just more sensitive to them?
Well, it's both. In one way, things are much better now than they were 20, 40 years ago, demographically.
Yeah.
Back in 1992, the surveys of American population reported or discovered that about 7% of the country described themselves as non-religious, whatever that means. It doesn't mean they were all atheists, but they just were non-religious. In 2001, that jumped to 14%. that same question jumped to 14%. Today, it's like 28%.
Yeah.
So whatever that means demographically, and maybe about half of those non-religious you would consider free thinkers, non-theists, atheists, agnostics, secular humans, whatever. Depends how you ask the question. Whatever that means, that's a phenomenal growth. It's non-religion is the fastest growing religion in the United States right now. If you want to call it a religion, it's not, but a religious identification.
Yeah.
And Christianity is shrinking. Islam is growing a little bit, but it's such a tiny amount. And Catholicism is shrinking. And so by comparison, Jews in the United States of America are a very respected minority, respected by most of us, I would say, a very respected minority at about 1.5% of the population, right? And we all consider that to be a valid religious position, Jews, and it is. Obviously, it's a part of the freedom of our country. But at 1.5%, they have some influence in the government and in society. But non-religious are 28%, or if you just cut that in half, if you just say 14% of Americans are non-theistic, look at that comparison. Yet why are our views not yet as equally
formalized, isn't it? There's no kind of formalization of the views of, like, I've been I'm a columnist for OnlySky, which is a new media organization which has just been started up to give voice to the non-religious. And what they did in order to get funding for this new startup, I mean, we're mainly an American organization, but they had to go to investors and hedge fund managers and whatever, and deliver a whole demographic presentation on, like, if you're going to put money in any group, you want to be putting money into a group that's growing. So if we're looking to represent the non-religious, where's this going to be in 10 years' time? Well, in a much better place than the religious. So, this is a good investment. And, we got the investment to start OnlySky as this media organization. But I think that's representative of the idea that that's moving in the right direction. But at the same time, the demographics are moving in the right direction. What's going on in the actual corridors of power?
Yeah. So then we're seeing kind of the opposite. And in a perverted sense, I think that's a good sign. It shows that they're scared, they're nervous, because historically the religious right has lost and lost and lost and lost and lost historically up until almost recently. They lost all these battles in the courts and in the court of public opinion. Birth control, let's say, homosexual rights, homosexual marriage, abortion rights, prayer in the schools were taken out, evolution, creationism in the schools. These battles that have been fought, they have lost and lost and lost. Their numbers are going down, 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 down. Christianity is shrinking, and especially white Christian nationalists are shrinking and shrinking, whereas in the past, they used to have all this power. That group of people has the sense that they have lost something. The people who stormed our Capitol on January 6th, 2021, they were all wanting to reclaim, to make America great again, which I think make America white again, basically. What are they resisting? Immigration. What are they resisting? They're resisting others, the others coming in to threaten their once precious privileges that they're now losing. So I kind of think it's like a wounded animal in the forest. It's been shot and it knows it's dying and it's thrashing around and it wants to take everything down with it that it can as it's dying. And so it's very dangerous right now.
Do you know what? In many talks I've given and interviews, I've said exactly that same metaphor, which is that I think that there are things happening that makes it look like there's a backsliding in terms of, like, religious power and the changing of laws and so on and so forth. But I think that's probably representative of a wild animal with its back against the wall in its death throes, like lashing out because it's scared.
Well, and it's lashing out is very dangerous. And look what's happening now with our current Supreme Court. They represent the old guard. They represent the old day. They do not represent our nation right now. All the studies show that the people are much more liberal, much more progressive, much more tolerant than the old leaders that were who were put in with the express purpose of maintaining and conserving the old way. So we're up against that right now. And what's scary is that the Supreme Court is a law unto itself. They can do whatever they want. They can make whatever rules they want. And if a majority of them want to say that, blue is pink, they can do that. They can actually do that. So this is scary right now. And so, we are on a voter drive in our organization. We can do that legally. We're trying to make sure that not only free thinkers and the non-religious, who are a huge part of the country, but young people. If young people would start voting, and usually they don't start voting until later. But if young people, like my grandkids, who are voting, by the way, they care, that would make a huge difference. So
it's that mobilization that, when elections go right, it's because you've got a mobilized population that get off their backsides and vote, including and particularly the young.
Yeah.
But there's an argument to say that the only reason you vote in a president is to vote in the president's Supreme Court nominee. Really presidential voting is about the Supreme Court. And it's like a proxy, and you can see that Trump was the most successful president, arguably, in the history of U.S. presidents with the Supreme Court nominations, or certainly in living memory.
Yeah, but also, and that may be true on its face, but it's also true that he's one of the least representative presidents.
Yeah,
he lost the popular vote.
Yeah,
and his Supreme Court nominations were voted on by senators who represent less than the majority viewpoint.
Yeah.
The way our system works with senators,
and
how that works.
Yeah. So quite often with the senators, because you just get 2 per state, then they're often with the GOP. It's obviously the least populated states as well.
Yeah.
So the rural demographics that skew GOP. That you're absolutely right. There's a really interesting lack of democratic representation that then goes into these decisions.
Because California has, I think, about 20 times the population of Wyoming, something like that. And yet they each get 2 senators.
Yeah.
So the 2 Wyoming senators have just as much representative power as the 2 California senators. And they're the ones who confirm the Supreme Court nominees. So, so that's, at least we can say that. At least we can say that what they're doing is, in effect, non-democratic. It's non-representative. So, but of course, power wants power, and they don't want to lose what they have. And so we have a real fight here.
It's all about maintaining those power structures.
Yeah. Well, and on the other hand, fighting this problem gives us something meaningful to do in our lives, right?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it works both ways. Melody, thank you. Ricky, thank you. That's really, really, really generous of you. Vaguely agnostic, VA, great support to the channel. I don't identify with the argumentative branch of the atheist movement. I identify as secular. I was raised without God in my home and not to hate religion. So yeah, and that's I think a very healthy. I don't know if maybe you've experienced this. I mean, Dan, you seem to be not the most militant atheist that's, although you obviously have very strong views, but it seems like a healthy concoction of views. I see people who were fundamentalist religious who go straight to atheism, which is exactly what you didn't do. You took that liberalization, gradual movement, and then sort of flipped to atheism. But those people that do those quick 180 flips often become the militant, angry atheists because they feel that resentment of having been, lied to or whatever. However they feel angry about what had happened to them before, and that 180 shift isn't as healthy. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, we're not all the same, obviously. No. We all have different histories, different motivations, different makeups, different psychological and emotional temperaments, and so on. Different reasons maybe to be angry. So I don't think we can make a blanket statement about atheists. There's obviously going to be some in that cross section or in that curve who are more pushy, angry, and militant. Our organization, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we're not barging into churches and dragging people out of their pews and trying to hit them over the head and say, how stupid of you to believe in talking snakes and, walking on water. We're not doing that. We think in our country, we think in the world, people should be free to believe whatever they want. So we're not militant in that sense. But where we are pretty forceful is when it comes to the courts, when it comes to fighting back against religious right people who want to use our government to promote their religion. So we take lawsuits, we do legal action in court and out of court. In fact, most of our victories are out of court to try to stop that preference for religion within the government. And a lot of it happens in the public schools. We just stopped a public high school teacher from preaching and proselytizing students during class time, in the classroom and in the hallway, telling them they're going to hell if they don't take his religion. We complained about that, and the school did the right thing. They reprimanded the teacher and said, you were hired to do this job. You were not hired as a preacher. So it's stuff like that. Members complain, people complain to us, and we take action. And in that sense, I don't know if the word militant is the right word, because militant implies like violence.
I'm using it in a colloquial kind of like just that angry.
Yeah, but in that sense, we are quite strong about preserving the neutrality of our government, that the government should not be promoting or hindering. We would be just as angry at an atheist teacher who was pushing atheism during the school hours as well. That would be...
Which is annoying, because like Christians should agree with you, because if they had their child having a Muslim press their views, or a different sect of Christianity, for example, the Jehovah's Witness, like pressing their stuff, then they would be up in arms. But it's like that double standards. Yeah,
but in the government. So we don't sue people. We don't sue churches. We do sometimes report churches to the IRS who might be violating the IRS codes. In fact, we just did a big announcement about a church in Tennessee, but we sue the government. And when we sue the government, we are suing them as government actors, not as individuals. So we'll take a lawsuit, and then that actor might change to a new person. Well, the lawsuit continues because we're suing the office to make sure that state and church stay separate, which is good. In fact, in many of our lawsuits, we are joined by religious people, by Protestants and Catholics and Jews and Wiccans and Unitarians who agree with us that it's bad for the government to be pushing religion.
Yeah. And that's what you want. You want that pluralism, like fighting for the same cause, that plurality. So just to rewind or go left field from here. So one of the books I'm reading of yours is Mere Morality, which is your answer to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, where he, as you said, peeled back Christianity to the core elements. And you do the same for morality, peeling back morality to the core elements. You talk about three moral minds: the moral intuition, moral reasoning, and moral law, or intuition, reason, and law. And this, is obviously pertinent to this discussion we're having as well, because we're talking about morality and law and so on and so forth. What can you just talk a little bit about that book, and what were you trying to achieve with writing Mere Morality?
Yeah, because we hear that a lot. If you don't believe in God, how can you be good? Don't we need absolute moral standards? Aren't there objective moral facts in the universe? And if there are objective moral laws, isn't there an objective moral lawgiver? Therefore, you hear those arguments a lot. And I do a lot of debates where these things come up. I just did debate number 138 in Florida. Public.
You are the most debated, or the highest number of debates, aren't you? So
I think so. If there's somebody keeping world records, that doesn't mean I'm any good at it, but it means that I've done a lot of them. After the first 20, 30, or 40 debates, I don't necessarily feel like I'm improved a whole lot, but I'm just a lot more relaxed. If you know what I mean, you've done it enough. You're not so nervous and worried, and you've heard these before. But morality comes up a lot in these debates. And in fact, my opponent in Florida recently, Andrew, what was his name? Andrew Johnson. He brought up, his opening statement had three basic points: design with the fine tuning, first cause, and then moral. He says there are objective moral facts or moral truths. I forget the exact words. So the book you're reading of mine called Mere Morality, it's not really answering C.S. Lewis. What I'm doing is I'm complementing C.S. Lewis by paralleling his approach with Christianity, doing the same thing with, or attempting to do the same thing with morality. Can we strip it down? Because morality can become this huge discussion that's, moral frameworks and philosophies and this and that, and utilitarianism and reverse utilitarianism and on and on and on. So I wanted to just sort of say, can we talk about the basic core? And so you mentioned the three moral minds. And if you've read far enough into the book, I'm not talking like we actually have three separate brains in our, it's just a conceptual way to picture what's happening. And it's like, you've seen those old cartoons of this person who's having to make a decision, and there's an angel on one shoulder and there's a devil on the other. They're going back and forth. What do I do? What do I do? You've seen this sort of caricature of how, we're caught in these moral dilemmas. And there are many moral dilemmas in the world. And I think one of the big mistakes is for us to think that there always has to be a black and white answer to each of these moral dilemmas. But that's different. But so I think instead of using revealed truth to tell us what we must do, or instead of doing this simplistic little, like Pinocchio did, Jiminy Cricket, give a little whistle and your conscience will be your guide. I mean, that's cute, but it's, how useful is that? You can't just give a little whistle and then what's the right thing to do. I think there are basically three guides to making moral decisions, any of which you would consult but not necessarily follow. And on this one shoulder here is what I call instinct. I think as social animals, we have evolved some natural biological instincts to act morally. And the first example I give is that time when I saw the baby falling in the airport. And without any thought, I wasn't standing there, philosophizing, okay, now what is the best cost benefit analysis to my act? You know what I mean? I wasn't
meanwhile, baby goes,
yeah. I wasn't like, what would Yahweh want me to do? Or what would Allah, or how, you know what I mean? My hand and my leg just immediately reached over and stopped that baby from falling without any actual conscious thought. And I think all of us are like that. It wasn't, what I did wasn't great. I think you would have done the same thing. Who wants to see a baby fall on the floor? So I call that an instinct. I think biologically our species evolved because people who were less likely to catch falling babies were less likely to pass their genes into future generations. Therefore, we are the recipients of people who were more likely to catch falling babies or to do other altruistic, socially moral things.
So moral instinct is an adaptive trait that is selected in.
Yeah, and it's not always right. I mean, I might have hurt myself. I might have caused more damage. You know what I mean? Yeah. I might have, who knows, if the floor was wet or who knows what. But there, I have to admit, there was some instinctive thing that happened. What is it that makes you hold the door open for the person behind you? You don't have to do that. You don't know those people. I didn't know that baby's family. They might have been Republicans. Who knows? They might have been somebody. And yet, as a human being, I have an instinctive, and I think most human beings do have a generally positive instinct to wanting to avoid harm or to minimize harm in the world. That's on one shoulder. On the other shoulder, we have not the minds of our ancestors making the decision for us, which is instinct. We have law on this shoulder, and law is the collective mind of the society in which we live. So law is a kind of prejudgment. When you look at the speed limit on the highway, you don't rationally analyze that. Is that the correct speed limit? Am I, you know what I mean? You basically sort of take it that I live in a society that's for its own good. Most people would, agree that for safety reasons, for road hazard reasons, for taking into consideration, there's probably, I would assume there's some scientific basis between the driving patterns of the average driver and the road conditions and the speeds of those are sensible laws that we would follow. Although once in a while you will disobey those laws. If I have a choking baby in the back seat of my car and I'm getting to the hospital, I'm going to break that limit because there's another principle involved to lessen harm. But I take it as a guide. I take both of these as guides, but they're not necessarily to
Rule of
be
thumb.
followed.
Yeah.
But the mind in the middle, the moral mind that's not of your ancestors or not of the society, it's your own individual mind, that's reason. Reason then sits in the middle, and reason looks both ways. Reason thinks it through. There are times when I shouldn't go against the don't walk sign, but there are times when I should, for good moral reasons. I should disobey a law for good moral reasons. There are times, although I know I'm increasing the risk of harm, there are times when reason calls for us to make those decisions. And I don't know how far you are in the book, but the underlying principle is what I call the harm principle, that to be a moral person involves acting with the intention of minimizing overall harm. You know, your intention might be good and you might make mistakes. Well, then you learn from it, right? You might have good intentions, but if your intention is basically to end up with overall less harm in the world, then you are a moral person. Sometimes you have to actually create harm to minimize harm. You might have to amputate a limb. That's horrible. Cutting off somebody's leg or arm is a horrible thing to do, but it could save their life.
But also what fits into that, because I've talked about how like take the Aztecs, right, who were sacrificing people because they thought by sacrificing, appeasing the gods, the earth would, or the sun would rise, and so on, so you would get crops. So part of our reasoning is dependent upon like correct information. So it's garbage in, garbage out. So if you have incorrect beliefs about reality, such that I need to sacrifice, so my point is that they were doing moral good. Like from their point of view, their intentions were like arguably morally good, given that literally if we don't sacrifice somebody, then the sun isn't going to come out and everyone will die because we won't have any crops. So it's interesting. Yeah, but broadly, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, the sun did come out, so were they right?
Well, I presume they eventually found that it wasn't right, or that they were killed.
So the law on this shoulder, this moral mind over here, works if you have the benefit of living in a society with humanistic values. If you live in a theocratic or tyrannical society that has laws that tell women how they should dress, or that they can't go to college, or you know what I mean, if you have, and this is where reason comes in. Reason doesn't just swallow this shoulder over here. Reason says, wait a minute, is that good? Is that a good law, or isn't it? And if it's not a good law, if it doesn't have the intention of minimizing overall harm in the long run, informed, as you say, by science and reason, then we should change that law. If we're lucky enough to live in a democratic society where you can do such a thing. Some people don't have that luxury. They live in a country or society where they have no chance. They have to kind of go along to get along.
Yeah, and what I love about the book is that it completely aligns with my philosophy. So my regular viewers will know, because I bang on about this all the time, but for me, abstract ideas don't exist, right? So there's no realm outside where we have an objective morality, where we have like the idea of what a hero is, because my definition of a hero is going to be different to your definition. My examples will be different to your examples of who a hero might be, and so on and so forth. And this happens throughout the world because all concepts depend on the conceiver. So we all have individual conceptions. And then when we agree, we write dictionaries and we write encyclopedias. And when we agree on what's a good moral principle, we write that into a philosophical kind of rule. And then we try and vote someone in who will enact that into law. And then hopefully enforce that in government. But the idea that these things all come from our minds, which is, a mixture of moral instinct, as you say, and moral reasoning, then we put that, and the end result of these things across lots of people will get us to a moral law. But of course, these things can change.
And of course, the question is, what do you mean by moral law? And I unpack it to mean you're lessening harm. If you have a smorgasbord of religions, there's thousands of them, and you're trying trying to order them, or you're trying to say which religion is good and which religion is bad. When you're doing that, you're putting yourself above the religions, and you're using some standard, some framework by which you can then judge those religions. And generally, what is that framework? It's harm. How much harm is this religion causing, or how much harm is this religion lessening? And surprise, surprise, most religions talk about love and peace and community, right? They all do, like it's a big deal. Our religion is a religion of love. Well, they almost all say that. So what that shows is that those are transcendent human values above and beyond the religions, by which we then can judge whether or not we like this religion or not, or this philosophy or not, or this politician or not, or whatever. We're using a judgment. And maybe it sounds overly simplistic, but I think you can boil morality down to that one word: harm. And harm, whatever it is, it's natural. Even psychological harm is natural.
I mean, so the power of utilitarianism, which looks at so maximizing pleasure and minimizing harm. So it takes that principle, and the reason why, and there's problems with all moral philosophies, so none of them are perfect. So, but I don't want to get into the deep grass of that. But the power of utilitarianism primarily is because lack of harm, or lack of, lessening harm or increasing pleasure, is that those ideas are what are called non-derivative, which is to say that, Dan, if you were happy, if you had pleasure now, right, and I asked you, if I said, why did you give $10 to that homeless person? You might say, well, because of this. And I said, well, why do you want this? Because of this. Why do you want this? Because of this. It would eventually come down to, because either I or everyone is happier, or there is less harm, right? That's because you can't derive that further. Because if I said to you, Dan, well, why do you want to be happy, right? It's a self-evident truth, right? It's an axiom. So if I said, why do you want to be happy? You shouldn't be able to derive that further. It's like, well, I just want to be happy. It's just, there is no further place to go. Or why do you not want to be harmed? Because it's obvious that I don't want to be harmed. Do you see what I mean? So these are called non-derivative, like currencies, non-derivative values for morality, which is why they're so powerful.
Well, for any organism to succeed, or even flourish, whatever, in order for it to survive, at least minimally survive, it wants to avoid suffering. So if you stick your hand into a fireplace, you don't stop and think, oh, that heat is damaging the cells of the tips of my fingers, and if I allow this to continue, it would compromise my ability to function as an organism. I would conclude, therefore, that I must withdraw my hand from that fire. Is that what happens? A natural organism naturally recoils from harm. We naturally avoid it because why? It's not good for our survival. You don't have to think about a lot of these things. I didn't have to think about that falling baby. It was one of these just natural things that happen. And in my moral philosophy, I don't think maximizing pleasure is the goal, because what is your pleasure? What is my pleasure? And what is your happiness and what is my happiness? We can all decide that for ourselves. No one's going to say, here's how everybody must be happy in the world. Here we have a philosophy that determines that.
Yeah.
And I don't even think suffering is the rule. If suffering was the rule for morality, then I could shoot a sleeping person in the head and kill them. They would not suffer, would they? There would be no suffering. Right. There would be no pain. Right. And I could say, hey, I did something moral. I didn't cause any suffering or any pain. But I did harm that organism. I harmed it from its ability to function the way it evolved to function. So, yeah, suffering is a part of it, and happiness is a part of it. But one of my problems with general utilitarianism is that if it's the maximum happiness for the maximum amount of people, how do you compute that equation? Even governments can't really fully do. I mean, perhaps utilitarianism would be a good moral philosophy for a government. If you could do that, if you could try to compute.
And I think they broadly do that in certain ways, or certainly consequentialists. Like they look at, well, if we're going to enact this policy, what's the evidence basis that we have that this policy will bring about X, Y, and Z? So they are taking some kind of consequentialist approach. But yeah, it's very difficult.
But putting aside, and it's important and it's necessary, but putting aside governmental policies, which we all need to be a part of, I'm thinking about my personal day-to-day life. How do I act as an individual, regardless of what these grand philosophies are above and beyond me, which we need? In fact, we do give $10 to homeless people, and more. Sometimes we're helping a homeless woman move into an apartment finally for the first time. She was sleeping in her car, of all things, for a long time in freezing Wisconsin weather. So part of the reason for giving the $10 or whatever to this homeless person is that it's empathy. I just feel bad when I see that woman suffering. I don't think my $10 is going to help that much in her overall scheme of life, but I just feel, and some people don't.
No. So you're absolutely right. Psychology is hugely important in morality. There's no doubt about it. And we know that from the trolley experiment. So, 89% of people pull the lever to save 5 people from dying and kill 1 person. But it turns out that if you were to push someone who was large enough to stop the trolley off the bridge, it turns out that 89% flips. What? But it's the same calculation. You're killing 1 person, saving 5. Why is it you can do that, but you can't do that? Psychology, empathy.
Well, I also think biology too. Imagine yourself on the bridge looking into the eyes of a person, right? And you are going to go up to that person and physically push them off. Could you biologically do that? That's why they need commanders in the military, because there are some soldiers who cannot pull the trigger to shoot another human being.
Yeah.
They just recoil at that. Some can. They're called psychopaths, right? That 4% are psychopathic, and they usually put them on the front lines, or they usually use those psychopaths to do the dirty work that the rest of us just can't do. So with the trolley problem,
one of the best books I've ever read is Robert Sapolsky's Behave, and he has a whole section on this about how people are unable to shoot in wars and the stats that are involved in that. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So pulling a lever at a distance would be tough, because you were going to be killing that 1 person and saving the 5. That would be a really tough thing to do. But actually going up to a real human being in person and pushing that's a whole different, as you say, a psychological thing that brings into, it brings biology, psychology, and all sorts of things. And you would start crying probably. I mean, you would just like, could you do that? Most people could not do that.
There's a really interesting YouTube video that's like a documentary. I think it's maybe from a documentary where they actually simulated this in real life. So they got I'll link it in the description. But basically, they create a hut, and they get people in on to do like some a day of like agency work, and they bring him in and say, oh, like, you need to pull this lever, and this guy's going to sit next to you, and he explains, oh, this is where the train comes along there. You can see there's some people walking across the track there and working near there, and this is what, and if I want to stop that train, I'll pull this lever, blah blah, and explains it. And it's all simulated, although it is like done with pre-recorded cameras. And he says that if I need to stop that, I'll pull the lever. Blah, blah, blah. And then he gets out and go, oh, I've just got to go make a cup of tea or something, and then leaves this agency worker in there. And they look at the things and see a train coming to kill 5 people on the thingy, and know that pulling the lever would do that. And one of the outcomes of this experiment was there was a lot of moral paralysis. There's a lot of people couldn't actually do anything because they're kind of waiting for someone else to do that decision, make that decision for them. Really fascinating.
Well, and then none of them, I would guess, were able to open their holy book and their Bible to ask God, what should I do here? Their religious training is totally useless. What is God going to tell? I mean, it's still going to come down to who you are as a human being.
Absolutely. We've got 5 minutes left for you, haven't we? You've got to shoot off soon.
I do have to leave. In about 8 minutes. I just want to say quickly that these moral dilemmas that are, the trolley problems are fascinating because they uncover a lot about morality. But fortunately, most of us don't live our lives with those day-to-day moral tragedy. If it did, we'd all have heart attacks. I mean, most of us are living our lives through a pretty general lower level, but it is useful to think about all of that.
I was just going to get some of your books out from the shelf, but I realized that my headphone lead didn't quite go that far. Someone asked what I'm wearing, what T-shirt I'm wearing. Just to let you know, it's the Queen's 70th Jubilee. So she's been reigning for 70 years. And I was trying to, like, everyone's wearing red, white, and blue today, and all this kind of union flags everywhere. My attempt at being as kind of nationalist as possible is, you know, keep calm by focusing on philosophy. So that's my T-shirt. That's my you know, thanks Queenie and all that. So anyway, I was going to get your books. But probably don't have too much longer to. I really want to talk to you about the resurrection. I want to talk to you about the Holy Spirit, about atonement, all these big ideas and how you make sense of them. But they're whole other debates in themselves.
Well, we can come back maybe in a couple months.
I'd absolutely love that, Dan. I really would. So yeah, absolutely. What I normally do for guests as we go towards the end, and if anyone has any super chats, please let us know straight away, because, you know, get in there quickly. Just my quick fire questions for people to maybe get to know you a little bit in a different way. So not much thinking here. Dan, what's your favorite fiction book?
Fiction book. Well, it might be Tale of Two Cities. For my whole life, I thought Dickens was pretty powerful.
Interesting, yeah. And actually, Dickens originally lived in Portsmouth, which is so there are loads of blue plates up in my local city of, like, Dickens lived here, or Dickens was born here and stuff. So yeah. Okay, favorite non-fiction book.
Favorite non-fiction book. Well, the one that first came to mind is Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. It was about the year 2000. I mean, almost all of his books are favorites of mine, but The Blank Slate was quite a corner turning in my mind.
Interesting, yeah, because that's a whole idea that we aren't born with a blank slate. That in fact that we come to life with, you know, different structures and brains and etc. Yeah, really, really important. Okay, if you had, I mean, you're a musical man. If you had a chance to see a band or an orchestra or whatever that you've never seen before, live or dead, who would you choose?
I would go see Oscar Peterson. He's dead now. Pianist, jazz pianist. Just blows everyone else out of the water. He was classically trained, but he had the courage to break out of his classical training to become a brilliant jazz pianist. I mean, I of course, others, you know, Bill Evans and all these other great pianists that are out there. But I would love to just sit and watch him play. His hands were monstrous. And even to the end of his days as a jazz pianist, he was taking classical lessons. So, I mean, I really admire that kind of personality.
Oh, that's brilliant. Brilliant. So another one to look into, Oscar Peterson. Okay, so you've got Last Supper. You're just about to be executed for being a heathen. Bad luck. You have a last meal that you can have. What would your last meal be?
Well, could I even eat at that point? Could I even eat? I'm not a picky eater, so it would be something very simple.
What would be your favorite meal? It's the last meal you'd like.
Well, I don't eat very much meat at all. We hardly ever eat red meat. So some kind of a fresh fish dinner, I suppose, would be a good choice, depending on where it is. Some local catch of wherever that execution is taking place.
Brilliant. Favorite movie?
Favorite movie? Okay, you're going to think this is really silly, because it is. I mean, it's. I have some favorite, you know, intellectual movies, but I like the movie with Steve Martin called The Jerk. That is so stupidly silly that I like to watch that over and over again. There's some lines in there that I even quote. So it's relaxing. It's fun. I will say my wife, Annie Laurie, she likes All the President's Men. We watch that a lot. She likes North by Northwest. We watch that movie a lot. And she likes a lot of the old black and white movies. But she and I watched The Jerk together about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we just had a good laugh. That was fun.
You don't see too much of Steve Martin. He does a lot of music though, doesn't he?
Yeah, he still plays the banjo, and he's got that song called "Atheist Ain't Got No Songs," which isn't true, but it's funny.
I've seen that. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. Okay, so final question is that you are just about to be attacked by a horde of zombies. You manage to just get down to your pre-prepared bunker that you have ready for these dystopian futures. and you're allowed to take 3 people with you, dead or alive. They can't be friends or family. What 3 people for a month would you have in this bunker with you?
What 3 people would I have in the bunker with me? Well, I guess one would be a musician. Somebody like Bill Evans, because he was quite the innovator. He brought in a lot of this modal music kind of stuff. I would like to pick his brain, or maybe Herbie Hancock. We could talk music. And as far as philosophy goes, Dan Dennett would be a good person to have. Not only is he brilliant as a philosopher, I'm sure you read all his works, but he's just a sweet guy. He's just a really nice guy. And in fact, I would ask him, in fact, a play that he has co-produced is going to be opening on Broadway in October about clergy who don't believe. The Unbelieving, I think it's called. They changed the name a number of times.
Oh, wow.
And it's based loosely on the Clergy Project. So he's inviting me to the opening night if I can get there, otherwise. And then after the play, they're going to have a discussion, post-play discussion. So
brilliant.
I would love to sit and just talk with Dan Dennett, partly because he loves palindromes and he loves anagrams. Dan Dennett invented a kind of a game with anagrams, and we're both good at them. And I came up with a concept called star anagrams, and an article is going to be coming out in a math journal about what I call star anagrams, but I don't have time to go into.
Oh my goodness! There's no end to you and Daniel Dennett's like
doing anagrams. Yeah. And I don't know if you know the wordsmith guy, Anu Garg. We had him on our show.
No.
He's got a big page on anagrams. So he has reproduced my article about star anagrams. And so the new article that's coming out that uses a computer algorithm to actually find them, and it's combining words with geometry. It's really a fun thing. So Dan Dennett would be really fun to talk with about all of that. And then who else? Maybe Andrianne. Andrianne, Carl Sagan's widow.
Oh, right. Yes.
The Voyager, and she wrote a lot of the Cosmos series. And
I think I listened to the Demon Haunted World on audiobook, and I think she read it.
Because she knows so much. She has so much history, and we were born the same month. So we would have so much to talk about in common.
What with you being the same star sign, right? And that's really
important. I guess I don't know. I think I'm over into Cancer or whatever that means, and she's anyway. But just her her knowledge and her history and her she was involved with that Voyager project, which is still functioning since the 1970s. It is still functioning, which
it's incredible.
So those are 3 out of another 100 that would be.
That's brilliant.
And then Jonathan, you would be like number 12 on the list. So so
damn, I had you at number 1, Dan. You've been bumped right down.
Well, but 12 is pretty high. So
that is actually. Yeah, I'll take that every day of the week. Look, Dan, all I can say, because I know you've got to rush to another engagement now. Thank you so much for the time that you spent here, and I would definitely love to talk to you again about all those topics, all the many topics we haven't even remotely scratched. And thank you also for writing the foreword to my latest book. And please go. Sorry,
it's a great book, by the way. 30 arguments against the existence of God. This is a nice way to phrase it, rather than being on the defensive. It's good to see somebody thinking proactively.
Yeah, no, and I really enjoyed writing that. Loved it. But yeah, thanks for your support there. Please rush out and get Dan's books himself. He's got a whole bookshelf of brilliant books. Godless is fantastic. Mere Morality is shaping up to be really good. His Free Will book is really good. Where can people find you? Do you want people to find you?
Yeah, well, online, of course, at ffrf.org. That's Freedom from Religion Foundation, ffrf.org.
Yep. So please check him out at ffrf.org. That would be fantastic. And check out his books from any reputable book seller. Thank you, Dan. I will let you go now, as I know you have to go. Really appreciate it. And I'll wrap things up here. But thank you.
All right. It was fun.
Yeah. Thanks. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we'll speak. I'll speak to you on the back channels. Thanks, Dan. Right. So I hope you got a lot out of that. Really enjoyed that discussion, and I can't wait to speak to Dan, hopefully in a couple of months' time, about all the things we haven't talked about. I really want to speak to him about the resurrection. He's got a great chapter in his book, Godless. I want to speak to him about the atonement and the Holy Spirit, and how, as a Christian, he kind of made those things work together, and how what he thinks of them now as an atheist. But that talk is done and dusted. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for all your huge support. Thank you for all of those wonderful people from Off Grid right at the beginning of the talk, to everyone through that, Mitch, all the others who have supported this channel all along and today. Really appreciate all your help and support. So thank you, Dustin, Ricky, everyone, really fantastic. So thank you. And thanks to the new admins that I've just thrown on as being admins at the side, thrown into it. So I really appreciate that. Anyway, as I always say, guys, question everything, particularly yourselves. Question it all. Try not to question me, because I'm definitely right, but definitely question yourselves. And I think Godless, I'm listening. Just there's a question here from the great Melody, who says, should I get God or Godless on Audible? I am listening to Mere Morality on audiobook. I get them through Kobo because I prefer that than giving Amazon more money than they need. But I love listening to Dan, narrate his own book. It's fantastic. Anyway, take care, everybody. All the best. Speak to you soon in another interview. Stay tuned. Please like, subscribe, and do all of that. Toodle pips.